So good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the principal of the university, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture by our Professor of Computational Cognitive Science, Frank Keller. Frank was an undergraduate at Stuttgart University before coming here to do his PhD, which he completed in 2000, and then went on to a postdoc position at Saarland University. He came back to here in 2003 as a lecturer, and since then has been a visiting professor at MIT. So Frank's research is on trying to understand how people solve complex tasks, understanding language, interpreting visual information, and so forth. So it seems to me he is very well placed to appreciate how difficult you're going to find his lecture this afternoon. As I guess many of you appreciate, if you are faced with a complex task to solve, then quite often a nice cup of tea helps. Well, another of Frank's interests is in rare teas. He's a connoisseur of rare tea. So I think he should be particularly well placed to help you understand his lecture this afternoon on how humans and machines integrate language and vision. So over to you, Frank.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Richard. Welcome to this inaugural lecture. It's good to see such a large turnout. So maybe this is because there's two parts to the talk. There's a cognitive part and a computational part, and there's a linguistic part and a vision part. So in some sense, it's four parts to the talk. Anyway, the title is fairly grand. How do we integrate language and vision? What I'll actually accomplish in this hour or so is slightly less grand. It's looking at one particular task where people have to speak and process visual information at the same time, and this task is image description. And there will be two angles to the task, one being the cognitive angle, where we study what humans do, and the other one is the computational angle, where we try to automate this process of generating image descriptions. Okay, but before I start, let me thank those two guys here, Marino Coco and Des Elliott, who are really the people who did all the work. Marino was a postdoc here until recently, and Des actually is starting a new job tomorrow in Amsterdam. He was a PhD student here. Okay, so thanks to the two of them. Anyway, so to situate this in a slightly more broad context, this is the endeavor of cognitive science, where we try to understand what the human mind does as it's instantiated in the brain. And here we have sort of a very schematic view of the brain that has different faculties, the visual cortex up here, and then there's an auditory linguistic cortex here, and so on. So broadly, cognitive function is located in different parts of the brain, and this has led cognitive scientists to break down the problem of understanding cognition into a set of functions. And these have generally been studied separately. So for example, people study how humans process visual information. And for example, if you have a scene, then humans would focus their attention on certain parts of the scene. There's a motorcycle here. And the areas that have hot colors are the ones that people attend to more, and the ones in cold colors are the ones where people don't attend as much. So this is one part of the endeavor, is to understand visual processing. Auditory processing is, of course, another cognitive function, where we study how a sound wave, such as this one, is interpreted by the auditory cortex and then fed into the overall system of understanding, for example, a speech signal. Language processing deals with structures such as these that break down the meaning of a sentence into its component parts, also known as syntax, and you would assign a syntax tree to a sentence like the one here in red. And that's another completely separate community in the cognitive sciences. Or motor control. Humans are very good at manipulating objects, such as this ball here and the racket, or whatever this is supposed to be here. So that's, of course, something that the brain does in the motor cortex. And so people study that cognitive function separately. So, and this has been very successful, sort of divide and conquer approach. You study vision, you study auditory processing, language processing, and so on, and it was all separate. The problem being that most cognitive tasks, of course, require the integration of multiple modalities. It's not enough just to understand vision or just to understand language. A lot of things we do on a daily basis require the integration of multiple modalities, what I will call cross-modal cognition, cognition that requires information from audition, from language, from vision, and so on. And here are a few examples. So here we have someone who is describing a picture, and she's pointing at the picture. She has a small audience here. She's presumably speaking at the same time. So there's visual processing going on, auditory processing, linguistic processing, maybe even some motor control, right? She's pointing, so that requires some motor action. And this is all happening at the same time. And so far, cognitive scientists have not paid, that's my argument, have not paid sufficient attention to this integration of multiple sensory modalities. Here's another example. This guy's playing football, and that requires the integration of visual information, motor information, maybe also auditory, there's noise in the stadium and so on. And again, the divide and conquer approach might not be sufficient to actually understand what's going on here. So how do we study cross-modal integration? Well, in my lab, we use a device called an eye tracker. And here we have a participant wearing that device. It's basically a headband here. And to that headband attached are two cameras, one for the left eye, one for the right eye. These are infrared cameras, high-speed camera that sample an image of the eye very frequently, 500 hertz up to 1,000 hertz. And they use infrared so that daylight doesn't interfere. So basically, the participant would be doing a task. Here they're just looking at the screen. There are some letters, but this could be an image, this could be a movie on the screen, it could be text. So we can study multiple modalities that way. And we get a very accurate picture of where they're looking and in extenso what they're processing while they're looking at the screen, while they're looking at at certain parts of the screen. And from the experimenter's point of view, you see the eye here in the infrared image, and you're tracking the pupil. And based on the position of the pupil, we can work out where on the screen the participant is fixating, where they're looking. And that gives us a very rich data source for understanding various cognitive processes. And that's the technique that we're going to use in the first part of the talk to study linguistic visual integration. But in order to sort of illustrate that a little bit more, we have a short video here. And this guy seems to be a famous footballer called Ronaldo. And he's being eye-tracked. So let me just play this. Take a second. OK, what you can see here, the eye tracker is being set up here. He wears a head-mounted tracker similar to the one we've just seen. Just checking the fit of the camera here. This is the image of the eye that we're getting. And this here is the what's called the head camera. So there's a camera recording what the participant, in this case Ronaldo, is seeing. And then there's his eye position superimposed. So the red dot is the eye position. So we know that at the moment they're looking at this face here. And we can see what they're paying attention to as they're doing a task. Well, in this case, playing football. See this in a minute. OK, so here the two footballers are being eye-tracked while they're playing football. And we'll see the output of the camera here. This is all very fast, right? This is in real time now. You can see this is now slow motion. You can see the participant. The football is following the ball. That's what they're doing most of the time. Now let me maybe stop it at this point. So you can see that not only are they following the ball, they're also looking at the opponent. So Ronaldo is looking at the feet, also here, the legs of the opponent. They're looking around. So in fact, you might think that playing football is all about following the ball, but in fact, they're doing much more than that. And they're looking at the space around them. Here, the slow motion image again. So they're looking at what the opponent is doing. Here, they're following the ball a little bit. But then they're moving back to the opponent. They're looking at what's happening around them, where they should kick the ball. Now they're trying to predict what the opponent is doing by looking at their legs and so on. So this is something that's not immediately obvious just by observing someone playing football. You don't know what they're actually paying attention to. But using the eye tracker, where we take someone's visual attention and superimpose it on the output of a head camera, tells us what they're paying attention to, whether they're looking at the ball, whether they're looking at the opponent, at the space around the ball, and so on. And so based on this, we can draw inferences about the cognitive processes that are going on doing a complex task such as playing football, which is, of course, one of these tasks that require cross-modal cognition. Okay, so unfortunately, the rest of the talk is not going to be about playing football. It's going to be about language and vision, so a slightly more mundane task, but of course, one that happens on a day-to-day basis. As you're listening to this presentation, of course, you're taking in auditory and visual information that's coming in, but you're also looking at videos, pictures, text on the screen. So again, you're doing multimodal processing. So we're interested in integrating language and vision. And the key question we're asking, how do we integrate information from those two modalities as they come in? And in order to make this question tractable, we're just going to look at one particular task, and that's the task of doing image description, where participants see an image and they have to describe what's going on in the image. They have to utter a sentence or two. And this task is also interesting from a computational point of view, and this is what the second part of the talk will be about. Once we know how humans do this task, we can then move on and try to automate it, getting computers to do the same task. Before we can start, I'll introduce a bit of background on language and vision. That's the first part of the talk. This will be quick, just to give you a feel for what people have found out by studying the modalities in isolation. And then we'll look at the image description task. We'll start from a hypothesis, which I'll call the referential hypothesis. And this hypothesis will then generate a prediction about how people describe images. And then we can run an eye tracking experiment to test that prediction. In the third part of the talk, as I said, we'll look into automating the task of image description. Okay. A bit of background. We've already seen that people make eye movements as they're looking at an image. You cannot take in the whole image at once. You have to move either your head or your eyes. Most of the time, people move their eyes, and they make what's called fixations. These are short periods of time where the eye is static. So here we have the fixations of 5 participants superimposed on the image. And what happens in between fixations? Well, the eye makes little jumps, very short jumps in the order of 20 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds. And so here, if we break this down into saccades and fixations, the lines are the saccades, and then the fixations here are the dots. And we can see each participant follows what's called a scan pattern. They start here outside the image, and then they enter the image, make a fixation, make another one, and then a few more fixations. In this case, the purple participant went back, the red participant went back and forth here, and then landed here on the motorcycle. In this particular experiment, the task was to find the motorcycle, so most of the scan patterns will end on the motorcycle. We can then turn this into a heat map, and you've seen a heat map like that before, where we basically find hotspots where people make a lot of fixations, and they spend a lot of time while they're observing the image. So this is just a way of summarizing the data, basically. Okay. In this experiment here, we're interested in the scan patterns, in the sequences of fixations, as we can see them here. Now you may ask, so what does it depend on? How do people decide where to fixate and what sort of saccades and fixations to make? Well, the literature has identified 2 main factors. One of them is image-based, so factors that have to do with the pixels in the image, basically, with the intensity patterns. So, for example, the fact that here there's a dog that differs in color from its surroundings, that makes this dog salient and will induce people to fixate in that part. And this is called saliency. Here you have a saliency map of the image that tries to bring out the salient parts of the image. A second set of factors are context-based or object-based factors, where you assume that the participant has recognized the objects in an image, and then they direct their fixations based on how the objects relate to each other. There might be out-of-context objects here. easy to guess. The toilet probably is out of context here, and thus would receive more fixations, longer fixations. So people also process the semantics, the meaning of the image, and how the objects in the image relate to each other. And that influences where they'll fixate. Moving on to language processing, people have then used the fact that fixations on an image reflect what people are thinking, what they're processing at that point. They've used that to also study language processing. And you can do this by showing people an image and giving them a sentence at the same time. You can either do production, where people have to speak a sentence, or you can do comprehension, where they listen to a sentence at the same time. And in both cases, people's fixations on the scene reflect their language processing. So the bit of the sentence that they're currently trying to understand is reflected in the sequence of fixations on the image. And this has led people to develop an experimental paradigm called the visual world paradigm, where this relationship between language and vision is made explicit. And in particular, they've discovered something called the eye-voice span, which basically says that in an image, you tend to fixate the part of the image that you're going to talk about a few milliseconds, typically 800 to 900 milliseconds before you talk about it. It's called the eye-voice span. So you look at an object before you mention it, basically. And this is going to be very important for the experiment I'm about to present. Here's a quick example from the literature, just to illustrate the eye-voice span. So I'm afraid this doesn't come out very well. You have two agents here. One is a mouse, and the other one is supposed to be a turtle, and the turtle is squirting water. No, sorry, the mouse is squirting water on the turtle. Here in gray, you have fixations on the turtle. So here's time on the x-axis and fixation probability on the y-axis. And in black, you have the fixations on the mouse. And here, the line indicates where people start speaking. So here, the utterance is starting, the mouse is squirting. And what you can see is that you get an increase in fixations on the mouse just before people utter the mouse, and then it drops off. And you get instead an increase in fixations on the turtle, and then roughly around here they would be uttering the turtle, the word sequence. Okay, so this is just a way of illustrating the eye-voice span. That what you're going to talk about is something on the screen or in the environment that you're looking at before you're mentioning it. This is called the eye-voice span. Okay, so this is just a quick run-through of the background in language and vision that we're going to need for the rest of the talk. And now let's look at one particular task. Remember, our overarching question was, how does cross-modal cognition work? How do people integrate modalities? And the hypothesis I'd like to put forward is that cross-modal cognition works through reference, through things that we want to talk about, that we want to reason about, that we want to point to, that we want to look at, and so on. So basically objects, either in the mind or in the real world, objects we can refer to by language, and so on. So these must be represented in the mind in some way, and these are the entities through which modalities can communicate. So we assume that modalities need to share a common set of primitives in order for them to be integrated. And I will argue that reference play a role. These can be linguistic entities, such as nouns, for example, or noun phrases, or visual entities, such as objects. And so the cognitive system integrates them through an interface, through a referential interface that relates the two types of reference to each other. And this is how I would like to propose cross-modal integration works. And that's just a hypothesis at this point. How can we test that hypothesis? Well, here we ran an image description experiment. So we got participants in front of the screen. They looked at images just like this. They were prompted with a cue word, in this case, suitcase. So basically, here's an image, talk about the suitcase. And then they had to produce a sentence. For example, they said, the suitcase is on the counter next to the man. And of course, they were in an eye tracker, so we have their eye movements. We know what they're doing as they're uttering the sentence. We know what they're doing before and after as well, and this will actually become important. Okay, so this is a very constrained, simple task in which we can study cross-modal cognition, visual attention and language processing at the same time. And while they're doing this task, participants are following a scan pattern, right? So it's like, if you remember the picture with the motorcycle, participants made a sequence of fixations and looked presumably at a sequence of objects in the image. And this is called a scan pattern. And in an abstract sense, a scan pattern is just a sequence of objects. So here the participant, for example, fixates this object first, the man, then he fixates a receptionist, goes on to the plant, goes on to the suitcase, then to the plant, then back to the receptionist. So we get a sequence of objects. In the abstract, that's what a scan pattern is, and this is how we can code it. So we can just treat it as a string, essentially, as a string of object labels. What is a sentence? Well, a sentence is also a string, right? A sentence is a sequence of words. Let's assume they utter this sequence of words, then that's the linguistic sequence. So we have two sequences. We have the visual sequence, the scan pattern, and the linguistic sequence. And now if our referential hypothesis is correct, then people should relate those two sequences to each other. And that's what we're going to test. So remember, we said reference are critical for cross-modal cognition. And we saw that people produce two sets of sequences, scan patterns and sentences when they describe an image. So our hypothesis now makes the following prediction, that speakers that follow similar scan patterns should also utter similar sentences. Okay, and that's now finally something that we can actually test experimentally. Okay, yeah, here's just an illustration. So we have one participant, subject 1, is uttering this sentence, is following this scan pattern, this sequence of objects, and another one has a similar sentence, and they should also have a similar scan pattern. Whereas a third one maybe utters a different sentence, and by hypothesis, they should also follow a different scan pattern. Right, that's the logic of the argument here. And now we collected some data to actually test that hypothesis, to test that prediction. Okay, just to reiterate, scan pattern similarity should correlate with sentence similarity. So we did an eye tracking experiment where we collected people's descriptions of visual scenes while they're looking at an image and while they're describing it. They were prompted with a noun, for example, man or suitcase. We found that this makes the descriptions more uniform rather than just telling them, tell us what you see. We gave them a cue. That made the task more manageable. We also manipulated visual clutter, how many other objects there are in the image. That's not something I'm going to talk about. We got 24 participants describing 24 scenes each. So we get a total of 576 scan patterns paired with sentences. Okay, and how do we analyze the data? Well, first of all, we need to get our scan patterns. And in order to achieve that, we broke down the scenes into objects. So some poor undergraduate had to sit down and draw polygons around each of the objects and sometimes parts of objects like the head here and the torso in all of the scenes. And so we have a set of labels here. These are the labels that are associated with each of the objects or parts of objects in the scene. So that means a scan pattern can be broken down into a sequence of objects. And now, of course, we need a similarity measure, right? Remember, our hypothesis was, going back to the hypothesis, speakers that follow similar scan patterns utter similar sentences. So now we need to define what counts as a similar scan pattern. And there's actually a fairly large literature on how to compare sequences. For example, in bioinformatics, where people look at biological sequences, protein sequences or DNA sequences. And we picked a measure from that literature called longest common subsequence, which works as follows. You compute all possible subsequences of two sequences, and then you select the longest one that's shared between the two sequences. And in general, that's a hard problem because you have lots of different subsequences if your sequences are long enough. But it can be computed efficiently, it turns out, using dynamic programming in an algorithm called the Needleman-Wunsch algorithm. This is, as I said, this is standard in bioinformatics, and that's something we used here to compare scan patterns. However, you can also use it for sentences, right? Remember, we have two types of sequences. We have sequences of words, i.e. sentences, and we have sequences of objects, i.e. scan patterns. And our hypothesis is if scan patterns are similar, then the corresponding sentences will be similar and vice versa. So we need to do sequence analysis on the scan patterns and on the words. Here's a quick illustration of how that works. We have scan pattern 1 here and scan pattern 2. And here in pink, we have the objects that are shared, the man, the statue. Then again, the man is being fixated. We have the lengths of the sequences of the two scan patterns. And here we have all the common subsequences. This one and this and this and this are shared. And then finally, this in pink is the longest common subsequence, length 3. And then the LCS score is the length of that longest common subsequence, just normalized by the length of the two individual sequences. So we get a number in the range of 0 to 1 from not similar at all to perfectly similar. And then we can do that for words as well, just that we have sequences of words in both cases, and then we have subsequences that we're comparing. Okay, so we now have all the machinery in place. Right, we have our scan patterns that we've collected, we have our linguistic sequences, i.e. our sentences, and then we have a way of comparing them and figuring out how similar they are, the scan patterns and sentences to each other. And then we can look at all possible pairs, right? It's a hypothesis about pairs of scan patterns and sentences. And we can analyze our data in a number of regions. We divide it into a planning region, which we define as from the onset of the trial, so when the image appears, to when the cue is found. Remember, people were given a cue, suitcase, man, and so on, something they should talk about. And that's our first region. Then once they found the cue until they start speaking, that's the second region, the encoding region. And then finally, the production region. That's from the beginning to the end of the description. So crucially, during planning and encoding, they're not actually speaking yet. Right? They're preparing to speak. And then during production, they speak. Okay, so we'll check those three regions, and we want to see whether similar sentences correspond to similar scan patterns. We compare this to a simple random baseline, where we just randomly pair sentences and scan patterns, and a bag of words model, where we don't take the sequence into account. We only take the overlap into account. Right? If we go back to this, we would just count how many items are in common. We don't care which order they occur in. This is to test the hypothesis that order is actually relevant rather than just object overlap or referent overlap. Okay, and this is what we found. Here on the x-axis, we have sentence similarity from 0 to 1, right? We have the not similar sentences here and the similar sentences there. And here on the y-axis, we have scan pattern similarity, again, low similarity and high similarity, and we can see that there's a nice correlation here between sentence similarity and scan pattern similarity. So if people follow the same scan pattern, then they will also utter a similar sentence. And this holds across the three phases. Yellow is the planning phase, green is the encoding phase, and red is the production phase. And here, the flat line, this is our baseline. So we just randomly pair sentences and scan patterns, then we don't get an effect. If we compute our correlations, we find a correlation of around 0.5 here between the LCS, the similarity score for sentences and for scan patterns. And that, again, holds across phases, is somewhat lower in production. The bag of words model, remember, if we discard the order, we just look at overlap and reference, gives us a significantly lower correlation, and chance is just gives us no correlation close to 0. Okay, so this seems to work. Remember, our hypothesis was references are critical for cross-modal integration. We put people in an eye tracker when they described images to test this hypothesis. We compared scan patterns, sequences of objects fixated, and sentences, sequences of words uttered. And during planning, encoding, and production, we found that when people follow similar scan patterns, they also utter similar sentences. Okay, so that's the good news. We have support for our hypothesis that references are critical for cross-modal cognition. The bad news is we can read your mind. Basically, we just need to know where you're looking, and then we know what you're going to say. Right? If this hypothesis is correct. So we know, if we know where you look, then we can predict what you will say, and even before you start speaking. Remember, we got a correlation even in the planning phase. During planning and decoding, people don't speak yet. They're just preparing to speak. But still, their eye movements during that phase reveal what they're going to say. Well, it's slightly less dramatic. We did a quick experiment here where we tried to accurately predict the sentence that people will utter based on their scan pattern. Right? So you can think of this as a simple machine learning algorithm that takes the scan pattern and then tries to select the sentence that belongs to that scan pattern. And here you can see the accuracy with which this is possible against the size of the set of sentences that we're selecting the correct sentence from. Gray here is chance, and green, red, and yellow is for the scan patterns for planning, encoding, and production. And we can see we're above chance, but we're not particularly high in accuracy. We're around 20%, and as set size increases, it goes down to 10%, maybe 5%. So we're working on the mind reading, basically. So it's not quite working yet, but if we have a small set of sentences that you can potentially say, then we're quite good at predicting what you're going to say based on where you look. So soon this will be, in your smartphone. Okay, let's move on. This was the human part of the talk. So we looked at how humans describe images, how the scan patterns they produce relate to the sentences that they utter while they're doing this task. And we looked at how this can be exploited for mind reading. But ultimately, what we would like to do is, of course, to take the human out of the loop, right? To be able to get those image descriptions automatically without having to sit down people and give them an image and say, OK, here's a description. What would that be useful for, image descriptions? Well, if you've ever used Google image search, then you'll have found that it's a bit hit and miss. So here I've looked for a car in front of gray sky, and some of the hits are OK. So here the sky is quite gray, but the car is also gray, so maybe that's why this came up. Here, this image seems to be pretty unrelated. This is also unrelated, other than it's a gray car again. These two, this one is good. This one is sort of good. But yeah, so image search is not perfect, and in particular, it's not good at understanding more elaborate image descriptions. If I just search for a red car, it will probably be OK. If I have a more complex description, it's not going to work so well. So that's where image descriptions would be good. Visually impaired users. So this is actually an app that you can download on your smartphone. You can take an image on your phone, and then you can get a description of the image. Potted green plant, or plant looks like it needs water. Unfortunately, these descriptions are generated by humans. So what the app does, it takes the image, it sends it to a crowdsourcing service called Mechanical Turk. People look at the image, type the description, get 5 cents for it, send it back. And that's what you see here. So it would be nice to automate this. This is actually an app that is very popular with visually impaired users. Right? They're not able to read a sign. They're not able to tell the color of a dress and so on. They snap a picture, send it to the service. It's called WizWiz, and they get a description back, except there's a human in the loop. It would be nice if we could automate this. We all have a large photo collection that we need to organize. How about generating descriptions for the photos automatically, based on the location, the date, the people depicted, and so on? If we could generate a concise description of your image, it would be much easier to find an image when you're looking for it. OK. And we have, of course, studied human image description. Is that something we can use now if we want to automate the task of generating image descriptions? So we saw that referential information is critical, right? The objects in the image are important. And we saw that people who follow similar scan patterns also utter similar sentences. And now I would like to hypothesize that this is also important for generating descriptions automatically. And actually, I would like to have a slightly stronger hypothesis, namely that the structure of the image is also important. So it's not only important what the objects are, but it's also important how the objects relate to each other. And the scan pattern, of course, is a very simple way of relating the objects to each other, just in form of a sequence. But in this part of the talk, I'll actually argue for something slightly stronger, namely that we need a hierarchical structure that binds the objects in the image together. And on the basis of that, we can generate good descriptions of images. Is there reason to believe that that's true? Well, let's look at two examples. So here we have an object. Again, this is a human-generated description of the image. I've highlighted the reference here, man, trumpet, boy, and so on. And the main description of the action going on is a man is playing a trumpet in front of a little boy. Here we have some of the same objects. We also have a man and we have a laptop. The description is quite different, though. Here people said a man is using a laptop. Here the man is not really using the laptop, they're using the trumpet, right? They're playing the trumpet. And how can the computer tell apart those two situations? Well, that's where it needs structure. So if we break down the images into the component objects, so here's the image, call it root, and then, oops, wrong direction. And then we have the objects here. We have the man. The man is beside the trumpet. He's beside the boy. The laptop is on the table. So here we have a structure that tells us how the different objects in the image relate to each other. And here's the same structure for the other image, right? Here's the man again. Then there's a laptop beside him. There's a cat, unfortunately, a pretty small cat. And the cat is on the sofa. And crucially, the configuration of the man and the object that the man is using are different, right? Here the man is beside the trumpet, and here the man is beside the laptop. So here we should describe this as the man is using the trumpet. Here we should say the man is using the laptop, because the structure of the image is different, even though some of the same objects occur in both images. Okay, and where does this notion of structure come from? Well, of course, linguistic utterances, sentences also have structure, and there's a long tradition in linguistics analyzing sentences, sequences of words, as elements that have structure, that have these little arcs that describe how the words relate to each other. Man relates to the by virtue of a determinant relation. Age relates to man by virtue of a subject relation. Apple is in an object relation, and so on. So in linguistics, this is actually a well-accepted notion that words are related to each other by hierarchical structure. And now my claim is that this can be extended to objects, so to objects and how they relate to each other. So we can basically have a grammar that tells us about the relations of the objects in a scene. So we go back to this. What we want to do, we want to take an image like this and parse it into a visual structure like this, similar to the linguistic structure that we see here. And now the prediction is, if we have image structure and linguistic structure, then this allows us to generate better image descriptions, rather than just having a set of objects that we don't know how they relate to each other. That is the hypothesis that we're going to test in this part of the talk. Okay, and we now need a formal device that generates these visual structures. We call it a visual dependency grammar, and the representations we call visual dependency representations, because they express the dependencies between visual objects. And more specifically, we have 8 relations that are defined in terms of pixel overlap, the angle between the object, and the distance between the objects. These are the relations that our grammar defines. An object can be on another object, x on y, can surround another object, can be beside it, opposite it, and so on. So there's a small inventory of relations that can express how objects relate to each other. And then we can annotate our images using those relations. For example, we have a description like this. A man is using a laptop. There's a cat lying on the couch in the background. And now we look at the nouns in the description. First one is first one is man. And we relate the root, which is just a dummy node, to the man. And then we have laptop. We relate the laptop to the man using the beside relation, right, from our inventory of relations here. Where is it? Here. Okay, and then the next object mentioned is the cat. So we attach the cat here to the root node. And then the cat is on the sofa, so we have an on relation between the cat and the sofa. So hopefully what we'll get is a tree structure, a hierarchical structure that's related to the visual structure that we're trying to generate, right? So we're trying to exploit the isomorphism between the visual structure and the linguistic structure to generate image descriptions. Okay, what we did next is we collected some data. We took a standard data set in the computer vision literature called the Pascal 2001 action recognition data set. It has about 2,400 images, and they all depict actions. Reading, for example, there's 10 actions in total in the data set, each with about 240 images. And then we got a number of, several levels of annotation for this set of images. First of all, each image got a description. 3 participants sat down and described the action in the image. Average length was about 20 words of the image descriptions. Then we got another set of participants to annotate the objects. They drew polygons around the objects in the image. And then we got another set of annotators to generate these visual dependency representations. So these are now representations that hold for pairs of sentences and images, right? Just like this one. So someone has cut out the objects, and then they have decided how the objects relate to each other based on the sentence description. And this is now the training data that we use to build our image description system. The image description system itself is broken down into 2 component parts. One of them that parses an image into visual dependency representations, into structures, VDRs, and another one that uses those structures to generate the image descriptions. For the image parsing, we can use a model from the literature called the maximum spanning tree model that basically builds a complete graph of all the possible relations of all the items and then prunes this graph down to a tree with the highest score. And the score of that tree is computed here based on the set of relations and the set of objects as simply a weighted sum of the features. So we have a weight vector here and a feature vector, and we're trying to maximize that score. So we're trying to get the best structure for a given image. What kind of features are informative for this task? Well, first of all, it's the features that derive from the image structures. Right, so here we have a man and a trumpet and a label beside between them. So we put all these triples of heads, arguments, and labels into the mix. We also look at geometric features such as the centrality of the object, the angle between the objects, the size of the object. These are, of course, very useful visual properties for identifying image structure. And then, and this is where this idea that you need to do language and vision at the same time comes in, then we also have alignment features. So we have, on the visual side, we have an above relationship between man and bicycle. And on the linguistic side, we have this parse tree for a man is riding a bicycle. And then we relate them to each other. So here, man and bicycle are related through an above relationship. And here on the linguistic side, man and bicycle are in a sibling configuration, right? They're siblings in our tree. And that is also a feature. We have a fixed number of configurations like this, which we also put into the mix. Here's another one. This is the ancestor-descendant configuration. OK, and now we can train our model. And we can test it on an unseen test set, where we give it the image, the images, the objects, but not the image parses, right? So we're taking the images and the objects in the image, and we generate the image parses. And so we can either do labeled or unlabeled parsing. And here's a baseline model, which just produces a flat structure. And if we then put our visual dependency relations into the mix, we get a performance of around 54%. This goes up once we add image features. Then if we add these configurational features here, which are called QDG features here, that gives us an improvement. And if we do everything together, then we get around 56%, slightly less in total. Or if we just count unlabeled dependencies, then it goes up to 68 roughly. Okay, so we have now automated the task of taking an image and the objects in the image and producing one of these VDRs, right? One of these structures here for the image. And that in itself is maybe not very useful. However, this is what feeds into our image description pipeline. Okay, that's why we're doing this, because our hypothesis was if we have these visual dependency representation, these image structures, we can align them to linguistic structures and we can exploit that to produce better image representations. Okay, so we have our image parser, turns images into VDRs, and now we take the VDRs and generate the image descriptions. And here we use a very simple template-based system. A template is basically a schema where you have to fill slots to get a sentence. So here there's a set of examples for the templates. For example, we have a determiner, then we take an object label, we take an auxiliary, a relation, another determiner, another object label, and so on. So these are very simple sentence schemas that we will use to generate the sentences that describe the images. And then we will test two types of models. Models that don't use image structure, and there's a number of models like this in the literature already that we can just re-implement, and models that use our VDRs, our image structures. And of course, our hypothesis was that using image structure helps. We get better descriptions if we know how the objects relate to each other in the image. Okay, so here's a bit more detail on the models that we're testing. One is a proximity model, which simply talks about objects that are close to each other. So here, for example, the laptop and the man are close to each other, so maybe it's good to mention those two objects, and it could say a sentence like, a man is beside a laptop. Not very good for verbs, right, because we only can say things like above, besides, and so on. However, we can get verbs from a corpus. A corpus is just a large collection of text. So we want to, in the corpus, we want to see what people do with laptops, what people do with cats, and we take the most likely verb that the corpus gives us. And here the model could come up, for example, with a man is stroking a cat, because there's a cat in the image, right? And it doesn't know that the cat isn't in any relation with the man. So in the corpus, it sees that man and cats, they're often in this relationship where the man strokes the cat. So maybe that's a good description. So that's another model that doesn't rely on image structure. So how about the models that actually use our image structure, right? So this is the VDR for this image. And the simplest thing we could do, we could just traverse this graph. We start here, we talk about the man, we talk about the laptop, we go back, we talk about the cat, talk about the sofa, and that's our description. So something like a man is beside a laptop, a cat is on the sofa. It's not very exciting, but it's a pretty okay description of the image. However, we can do better by using the parallel model. The parallel model now exploits the relationship between sentences and between sentence structure and image structure. Remember, we've used these configurations. Let me just go back like this. So we know how bicycles and man relate to each other, right? If it's an above relation in the image, then it's a riding relation in the sentence. So we're using this information now for producing a sentence. And so we can say things like the man is using the laptop. Okay, so this is all nice, but does it actually work? Okay, so we ran two sets of evaluations. The first one is where, again, on an unseen part of the data, we generated image descriptions and then compared those image descriptions against human-generated image descriptions. So what this graph shows is what's called the blue score, which is a way of quantifying how close the description is that we generate to the description that the humans have produced. And we see the proximity model, the simplest model, doesn't do very well. If we throw in corpus information, we get a pretty large boost in performance. If we throw in structure, again, we get a boost in performance slightly compared to the corpus. But if we use parallel structure between words and sentences, then we get a fairly large improvement. So that is our hypothesis, right? That exploiting these parallel structures, linguistic and visual structures, allows us to generate better image descriptions. And then we also asked the humans. So we gave people actually the output of the system and then asked them, how good is this output? So we did a rating study where they took the output of the proximity model, the corpus model, the structure model, and then the parallel model. And on a scale from 1 to 5, we get about 3.2 for the parallel model. So it's far from perfect, but it beats the other models that don't exploit the structure here, or that only exploit the visual structure. Okay, so again, our hypothesis was if we exploit visual structure and linguistic structure, we generate better descriptions, and these results seem to be consistent with that. Okay, what do the descriptions actually look like? So here we have the 4 models, and we asked them to describe this image, right? They haven't seen this image at training time. This is a new image that they need to describe. The proximity model said a man is beside a phone. There's also a wall and a sign in the image. That's all correct, but it doesn't capture the fact that the man is actually phoning. The corpus model is the man is holding the sign. There's also a wall and a phone in the image. So that's not so good because the corpus data led it to believe that men, what they do is they hold signs rather than using phones. So it was led astray here. The structure model captures the structure. A wall is above a sign. A man is beside a phone. Again, that's technically correct, but is not a very informative description. And our parallel model, I mean, obviously this is a hand-picked example, so it has to work. A man is holding a phone, and a wall is beside a sign. So here we've captured the relationship between the man and the phone. What would humans do? Well, they're more wordy to start with. A foreign man with sunglasses talking on a cell phone. A large building and a mountain in the background. I don't see the mountain, must be somewhere here, but anyway, so this is what we're up against, right? Human creativity. Okay, so that is the end of the talk. Let me just quickly summarize what we've seen. We started off by wanting to look at multimodal cognition, at how people integrate across modalities. We've narrowed this down to the study of language and vision, and even more narrow to the study of how people describe images. And there we found that people who follow similar scan patterns also utter similar sentences. And with some degree of accuracy, we were able to predict what you're going to say based on what you look at. Then in the computational part of the talk, we used these insights from our human studies to build a system that can parse images, that takes images, automatically turns them into structural descriptions, and then uses that to generate a sentence that tells us what's in the image. And we were able to show that if we combine image structure and linguistic structure, then we can generate better image descriptions than if we only use image structure or if we don't use any structure at all. We only rely on information about the objects in the image. Okay, thanks very much for your attention. Here's thanks to the team and the funders. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Frank very much for this inaugural lecture. One of the great things about working in informatics is that we're not just concerned about machine computation, but we're also concerned about figuring out how the mind might work. And there's a great history at Edinburgh in computational cognitive science, but I think Frank's work really extends this through the way it integrates work in vision and work in linguistics. And for me, there's two kind of linked things which I think are amazing from this talk. Basically, the kind of actually we can all go to the pub and say, yeah, for sure, things we see in scenes and things we talk about are linked, but to actually show that there's common sequence processing between linguistic objects, words, and the visual objects that you see in a scene is really quite outstanding. And then to continue to show this, that there's this parallel structure between the visual scenes and the way we process linguistics is also wonderful, and the way that this can actually move into actually generating descriptions of images. But I think the best way to thank somebody who's given an outstanding scientific talk is to ask them some outstanding scientific questions. So the floor's yours. Vito.
Well, thanks, Frank, for this great talk. I come only from the computer vision side, and I just there is a bit I didn't understand, and it potentially clashes with the word automatic. So in the third part of the talk, how did you get from the image to the polygons around the objects and the semantics? So here you would say, go back to that. So here you would go from the image to saying this is a person, that's a laptop. So I understand how the automation of the beside is, and going from that to the sentence, that's great. But from the pixels to these polygons, how did you go there?
So this is very disappointing. There's no computer vision. We are taking manually generated polygons.
Okay, so it's not yet completely automatic, because in fact that bit is very difficult. I just wanted to point out that there are thousands of people in Vision going crazy trying to solve that. I thought maybe I missed a piece of
No, that's why we didn't do it.
I thought I missed something.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Frank, for an interesting talk. I wanted to ask you a question about the lady at the beginning, you know, with the picture. You don't have to go back to it, yeah? And something about your data, which is, if she were an expert in Christian iconography, and that was a religious painting, would the scan patterns and the linguistic description bear any relationship to the sort of thing you've described? Or do you get things where people know too much about the image? And then at that point, there's the ghost in the machine somehow or another, and then you don't really see it.
Not sure I can answer that. So there's a lot of literature on how task and expertise influence scan patterns. So that's probably what you're alluding to. So depending on whether this lady here just talks about, well, for example, depending on whether she's an art expert, someone who can recognize forgeries, for example, they will have a very different scan pattern from a lay person who's just appreciating the painting. So that's something we know. And maybe that influences the relationship with the descriptions, but that's something that hasn't been investigated. Yeah, that's a good point. Expertise plays a huge role here.
So I was struck with those scan patterns you showed with the saccades, that there appear to be different classes of people who follow, in the same class, they follow the same pattern, or is that wrong?
So this, it turns out, depends a lot on the task. So if you give people a free viewing task, where you just say, here's a nice picture, look at it for 5 seconds, then you get a huge variation in the scan patterns that people follow. If you narrow down the task, so this was a search task. The task was basically to find the motorcycle in the image. And of course, everyone, to some extent, does the same thing. And then there's in-between tasks. For example, memorization, where the task is to memorize the objects in the image, and then in a later recall phase, recall as many as possible.
So my question is, if two people scan one image in a similar way, will they scan other images in a similar way?
Yeah.
Can you classify people as this
Yes.
group does it like that, this group does it like that?
Yeah, there's literature on that. People have shown that. Again, it depends a bit on the task, but you can identify groups of participants, and then on sort of clustering, and then on held out data, you can say this participant belongs to that cluster rather than this cluster based on their scan
something deeper than just the language they're using right now. It's something to do with the person they are.
Yes, so stuff like expertise and so on come into play, and also maybe viewing habits, yeah. So for readers, we know that the scan patterns that they follow during reading can vary a lot from individual to individual, and are a function of expertise, of text difficulty, of reading proficiency, and so on. So that's likely to be the case also for scenes.
There's been a lot of work in exploring deep learning for, say, machine translation, and in parallel also using similar structures for image classification. And they kind of all hinge on this idea of finding common representations between two very different looking inputs. And I guess I'm wondering if you're familiar with work that kind of does what you're trying to do, but in that framework where it tries to map from an image to a sentence or a sentence to an image in that way.
Yeah, so there's some work, for example, by Richard Socker in Stanford, and they try to use recursive neural nets to induce image structure and visual structure. And they used to do this in parallel, using the same architecture, but separately for vision and language. And now in more recent work, they've started to relate it to each other. As you said, there's machine translation work as well that tries to do the same thing for two languages rather than two modalities. And yeah, so the Socker group, for example, in Stanford is pursuing that. That's not something we've tried on our data set yet, but probably we should. Yeah. Final question in the front.
So after the first part of the talk, I was expecting that for the second part you'd say, here, we can do a model of how people look at images. And then from that, we'll predict what they're going to say.
We've done that to some extent, to a very limited extent. You saw the graph where we have just sentence retrieval. But yeah, ultimately, we would like to model what humans are doing. We would need an extra level of annotation, right? We could, for example, eye track people while they're describing sentences, and then also annotate the visual dependency relations for those images and those sentences. That's something we want to do, but we haven't done it yet. Yeah. So that's definitely the goal, also to model how humans are generating the descriptions.
Okay. So the cat is actually beside the person. I was wondering if ever it gave you that the man is using the cat.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's a very large set of relations between the objects in the image that you could potentially encode, and there is no correct set, right? Because you could describe the relationship between the man and the cat. You could say, this is his favorite cat, or he just got this cat and the cat is resting, or he just fed the cat, or you can talk about the man and the cat. However, this participant here didn't talk about that. Right? So we actually guide the annotation process by the sentence description. So we will annotate the relationship between the man and the laptop and between the cat and the couch, because that's what they're talking about. So the visual dependency structure will differ from sentence to sentence. So in fact, for this image, we have 3 descriptions, so that means we also have 3 VDRs. Because otherwise, I think there would be an infinite set of potential relations that you could annotate. And that's why we use the sentence to guide it. And that's why the cat and the man aren't related for this particular sentence image pair.
Okay, so once again, let's thank Frank for a fantastic lecture.